My father roared, "You were a disappointment," handing my trust fund to my sister. "She's a lawyer, and you're just wasting time with computers." I said nothing, just smiled and walked away. 3 years later, as I stood on stage at my company's IPO, their stunned expressions said everything. But I just smiled again. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mahogany bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that no one had read in decades. A fire crackled in the massive stone hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the dark-paneled study. Outside, the storm raged, rain hammering against the stained glass windows, but the real tempest was unfolding within. He stood at the center of it, spine stiff, hands curled into fists so tight the knuckles shone white. The air was thick, suffocating, every breath tasting of disappointment and scotch. Across from him, his father loomed, a titan of a man, broad-shouldered and gray at the temples, his presence as imposing as the portraits of their ancestors hanging in silent judgment above them. His sister, poised and elegant, sat in the leather armchair beside their father, her expression unreadable, though he could see the triumph lurking just beneath the surface. She had always been the golden child, the prodigy, the perfect one. A law degree from Harvard, a position at the most prestigious firm in the city. Their father's pride. And him? A disgrace. The old man's voice thundered through the room, rattling the very bones of the house. "You're a disappointment." The words hung in the air like a curse, weighty and inescapable. All that potential, wasted on computers. Playing with code like a child. There was a pause. The flames crackled in the silence. Then came the final blow, the trust fund, the inheritance, the legacy that had been promised since birth. Handed over to her. Every cent. He should have felt something, rage, betrayal, despair. But he felt nothing. Only an eerie, numbing clarity. He didn't argue. Didn't plead. He simply smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips, not of joy but of quiet, knowing certainty. Then he turned, stepping out of the warmth of the firelight and into the cold abyss beyond the study doors. The world outside was dark. Merciless, but it was his. 3 years passed in a blur. There were nights when he slept on borrowed couches, hacking together code under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Days when he lived on instant ramen, when exhaustion blurred the line between dreams and reality. Investors shut doors in his face. Friends walked away. The world was indifferent to ambition, it crushed the weak and mocked the dreamers. But he didn't stop. Through sleepless nights and endless failures, through whispered doubts and gnawing hunger, something began to take shape. The lines of code became something more. The algorithms whispered of possibility. The ones who had laughed at him began to turn their heads. And then, one day, it was no longer a dream. Now, as he stood beneath the blinding lights of the stage, thousands of faces staring up at him, the weight of it all pressed against his chest. The roaring applause was deafening, the camera flashes like white-hot bursts of lightning. The screens behind him flashed numbers that didn't seem real, figures that made Wall Street tremble. His name echoed through the vast auditorium. He didn't need to turn to know they were there. In the front row, his father and sister sat frozen, their expressions carved from stone. The disbelief, the silent horror, the sharp realization that the son they had cast aside had built an empire from the very thing they had dismissed as a childish obsession. He could almost hear the old man's breath hitch, and could almost feel the weight of his sister's stunned silence. Slowly, he smiled again. And then, the applause thundered through the auditorium, a tidal wave of validation washing over him. But he barely heard it. His gaze was locked onto theirs, his father's rigid, disbelieving stare, his sister's carefully composed mask cracking at the edges. For years, they had dismissed him. Ignored him. Stripped him of his birthright and left him to fend for himself. And now, here they were, caught in the glare of his success, their stunned expressions worth more than any inheritance they could have handed him. He stepped forward, gripping the microphone, waiting for the noise to settle. The audience hushed, anticipation thick in the air. The cameras were rolling. Investors, journalists, the world, everyone was watching. His voice, steady and smooth, carried across the vast hall. 3 years ago, I walked away from everything I knew. I was told I was wasting my time. That what I was building didn't matter. He let the words linger, his eyes flicking to where his father sat, stiff and silent, jaw clenched so tight it might have shattered. I was told I was a disappointment. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Some already knew the story. Others were hearing it for the first time, their curiosity piqued. He continued, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. But the thing about underestimating someone is, you never see them coming. The crowd erupted again, cheers, applause, knowing. Laughter. But he wasn't finished. He turned slightly, as if addressing the audience, but his words were meant for only two people. And now, this company, this empire we've built together, he gestured towards the team standing behind him, the ones who had believed in him when no one else did, it belongs to those who never stopped believing. To those who took the risk. A subtle pause. A deliberate, calculated moment of silence. Then, the final blow. As for those who doubted me. He exhaled lightly, as if letting go of something weightless, something insignificant. They will always have front row seats, to watch. The message was clear. He was never going to need them. Never going to ask for their approval, their validation, their acceptance. He had already won. The audience roared in approval, but he didn't look at them. His eyes remained on his father and sister. His father, who had built his empire through control and power, now sat in the shadow of a son he had discarded. His sister, who had once smirked as she took everything from him, now sat silent, her hands gripping the edge of her chair, watching as her younger brother ascended beyond her reach. He smiled one last time, slow, effortless, victorious. Then he turned and walked off stage, never looking back. As he stepped off the stage, the echoes of applause still rattling through the auditorium, he felt the weight of all those years lift from his shoulders. The struggle, the rejection, the nights spent in darkness wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life, it had all led to this moment. But the revenge wasn't complete. He strode down the corridor behind the stage, his team trailing behind, buzzing with excitement. Reporters were already scrambling to get exclusive interviews. Investors were calling, desperate to throw more money at him. But none of it mattered, not as much as the unfinished business waiting for him in the VIP lounge. He pushed open the heavy double doors, stepping inside. The private suite reserved for the company's most esteemed guests. And there they were. His father stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. His face, once so unreadable, now bore a look of something dangerously close to regret. His sister sat stiffly on the leather couch, her polished demeanor betraying cracks of something deeper, panic, humiliation, the slow realization that she was no longer the favored one. Neither of them spoke. He took his time, walking to the bar, pouring himself a drink as if they weren't even there. Let them sit in their discomfort. Let them taste what it felt like to be powerless. Finally, he turned, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, studying them with the same cool detachment they had once shown him. His father cleared his throat, setting the whiskey down with a soft clink. I underestimated you. Understatement of the century. He let the silence stretch before answering. You did. His sister scoffed, trying to regain control, her voice sharp. So what? You made a company. Congratulations. That doesn't change anything. That made him laugh, a low, knowing sound. You don't get it, do you? He set his drink down and took a step closer. This isn't about money. It's about power. She blinked, caught off guard. He tilted his head, watching them both. You think I came here just to rub my success in your faces? He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. No. I came here to show you what it feels like to be on the outside. His father's expression darkened. What do you want? There it was. The shift. The realization that for the first time, he held all the cards. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. I want nothing from you. No deals, no apologies, no second chances. His eyes flicked to his sister. I could have bought out your firm last month. Do you know that? But I didn't. Because I wanted you to see what it feels like to sit across from someone who can destroy you. And know they won't even waste the effort. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. His father exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face, and for the first time in his life, he looked tired. Old. And that was the final victory. He picked up his drink, taking a slow sip before setting it down for the last time. This conversation? He gestured between them. It never happens again. His gaze locked onto his father's. You made your choice. He turned to his sister. Enjoy the trust fund. I'll be too busy buying out the world to notice. With that, he walked to the door. No one stopped him. No one called after him. As he stepped into the hallway, he breathed in deep, filling his lungs with the air of freedom, of power, of knowing that he had won in the most satisfying way possible. As he walked out of the lounge, his pulse steady, his victory absolute, he felt something he hadn't in years, peace. But revenge, true revenge, wasn't just about walking away. It was about leaving something behind. A scar. A lesson. A reckoning. He reached into his pocket and tapped a few commands on his phone. Back inside, his father and sister were still frozen, absorbing the brutal weight of his words, when their phones buzzed in unison. Almost as if choreographed, they glanced down at their screens. And then, just as he had expected, their faces drained of color. His father was the first to react, gripping the phone tighter, his lips parting in stunned disbelief. His sister's hands trembled slightly, her sharp nails digging into her palm. A single notification. A single announcement. The hostile takeover was official. His father's company, the empire he had built brick by brick, the legacy he had once deemed too great for his own son, was his. Bought out. Piece by piece. Quietly. Methodically. Over months, through subsidiaries and shell corporations, until the old man hadn't even seen it coming. And now, with a single press release, the world would know, the company no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the very son he had cast aside. The silence in the room was deafening. His father slowly looked up, his face unreadable, but his eyes. His eyes were filled with something rare. Not just shock. Not just anger. But fear. Real, visceral fear. The fear of a man who had built a kingdom, only to have it stolen from under him by the one person he never thought capable. His sister let out a choked breath, shaking her head. No. No, that's not possible. But it was. It was already done. He leaned against the doorway, casually, effortlessly, as if he hadn't just shattered their world. You said I was wasting my time with computers. His voice was soft, almost amused. Turns out, I was just coding my way to the top. His father inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, but he said nothing. He smiled, slow, satisfied, final. And then he walked away, leaving them to drown in the ruins of what they once thought was untouchable. This time, he didn't just win. He owned everything. And this time, he never looked back.